Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. In this video we are answering a question that I get far too often and needs to be answered, and that is what inverts and fish can you add to your macroalgae aquariums to add a little bit of a cleanup crew. Now the answer is quite similar to what you'd add to a normal reef. However, there are some things which I find work really well, and also there are a couple of species which you might not want to add to your macroalgae tanks because they can do quite a bit of damage. So I'm going to break this into two parts. We're going to start off with invertebrates, and then we're going to talk about some of the fish that I like to use in my macroalgae tanks. The main cleanup crew you're going to be really adding to your macroalgae tanks are going to be snails. And the reason for this is because most of the snails that you'd add to your regular reef aquarium are pretty good to be added to your macroalgae aquariums. Most snails won't actually eat macroalgae. There are some that will, and I'll show you those in a minute. So a snail which I like to add to pretty much every single macroalgae tank I have are these little guys here, and these are dove snails. Dove snails are essentially micro grazing snails, but the beauty of them is the fact that they breed really easily. So you only need a couple of them, and then what will happen is they'll keep breeding and you'll have lots of them, and that's great because essentially they're free cleanup crew once you've bought your first few. One thing I like about dove snails in particular is because they are small and they are light, and it means that they can get in and on top of your macroalgae. They can graze on all the surfaces which larger snails wouldn't be able to get to. Other snails you can add are things like this, your regular turbo snails, any of the type, so your astrea or your trochus. They're all completely fine to be added to a macroalgae tank. I haven't found they do any damage, but they can be a little bit too large to get in amongst the macroalgae fronds, which is why I use the smaller snails to do that job. The other snail which I like to add to macroalgae tanks are the conches. Now conches go along the bottom and they graze algae from the sand substrate, and although they don't clean the macroalgae directly, they do keep the substrate of your aquarium very clean, and they stop nuisance hair algae overtaking the tank. So I highly recommend you add these conches. There's various different types. These particular ones are strawberry conches. There are larger and smaller varieties available, and they do a fantastic job. Another kind of snail that you can add are the nerite snail. Now there are many different types of nerite snails, and so long as you get proper saltwater ones, it doesn't really matter which variety or species you get, but they do a really good job at grazing. Much like turbo snails, they will graze on most surfaces of algae. One thing you have to be aware of is the fact that they can lay eggs, and they probably will lay eggs everywhere, and that's what these little white spots are on the back of the tank. They're quite hard to get rid of, but they do eventually dissolve, so if you're not bothered about having white specks everywhere, then nerite snails are a really good choice. So yeah, you can pretty much add almost any regular snail that you'd put in a reef tank to your macroalgae tanks. The only snail that I would probably avoid are these here. These are the giant Mexican turbo snails, and they're indiscriminate about what macroalgae they eat. So just be aware that these giant turbo snails probably don't want to be added to your tank because they will eat your good macroalgae. In terms of other inverts that you can add to your macro tanks, hermit crabs are perfectly fine. I haven't had any issues with any particular species of hermit crab. Obviously some hermits get bigger than others, so choose which hermit size is good for your particular size aquarium. I haven't had any issues with hermits at all. Other things that you can add to your macroalgae tanks would be things like sand sifting starfish or regular starfish, bristle stars, and other things like that. Definitely avoid urchins because they're going to be eating your macroalgae. But in general, most of the invertebrates that you'd add to a standard reef tank will be fine for a macroalgae tank. In terms of fish in macroalgae tanks, you do have to be a little bit careful. You may be surprised by the fact that there are some tangs that you can add to macroalgae tanks, and I actually recommend it. The only type of tang that I'd recommend you add are ctenochaetus tangs, and these are the bristle mouth tangs. These particular tangs don't have the mouth parts to actually chew and eat macroalgae. All they can do is rasp, and that means that they are perfectly safe to add to your macroalgae tank. Other fish you can add are things like blennies. Blennies are a great addition. Here is an algae blenny. I add these and I don't find that they eat any of the macroalgae that I want in there. They will just graze on hair algae, which is exactly what I want them to do. And there are other blennies that you can add. So you have the little blennies like this, the orange cheek blennies. I have had issues with this particular one because this particular one likes to eat the red bubbles of Botryocladia. However, other people have kept these particular types of blennies in and amongst their macroalgae, including with Botryocladia, without any issues. So I think it's on a case-by-case basis. Other fish you can add are things like watchman gobies or chalk gobies, anything like that, just to keep the sand a bit cleaner. You do have to note though, they will eat the sand and deposit debris quite liberally over your aquarium, so just be aware of that. One other fish that I like to add to my macroalgae tanks are mollies. Lots of people keep mollies in salt water and they do a brilliant job of just sort of grazing on hair algae and grazing on dust algae, very much like they do in freshwater tanks. Good thing about these as well is they breed really easily, so you can get quite a good number of them for free. So they're the fish that I'd kind of recommend. I do like to chuck in the odd wrasse as well. So in here we have a Lubbock's wrasse, and in here we have a 6-line wrasse, and that's just for the same reason you'd add wrasse as pest control in your main reef tank. They eat some flatworms, they keep down other sort of invertebrates and get out of control. So they do a great job. They don't hurt macroalgae. But in terms of other fish, feel free to add pretty much anything you like. I would be very, very careful with angelfish, because angelfish can definitely graze on macroalgae. One weird thing I found as well is pufferfish tend to have a penchant for grazing on macroalgae, specifically the dog-faced puffers. I've had a few dog-faced puffers and they've all decided to start eating my macroalgae. I don't know why. They were being fed regular food anyway, so just be aware that maybe dog-faced puffers are unsuitable for macro tanks as well. I hope this video has been useful. Thank you very much for watching. If you've liked the video, leave a like below, and also subscribe to my channel if you haven't subscribed already. Once again, thanks for watching and happy fish keeping!